Mary's day always began before the first light painted the sky. The sound of her modest alarm clock echoed through the small, dimly lit room she shared with her mother, Janet. Quietly rising so as not to disturb her mother's fragile sleep, she quickly prepared herself, slipping into her neatly ironed maid uniform, a simple black dress paired with a white apron, both showing signs of wear from constant washing. She tucked away strands of her thick black hair beneath her scarf, casting one last glance at Janet, whose breathing had grown more labored over the weeks. Mary swallowed down her worries. There was no time to dwell. As she stepped into the bustling city streets, her heart carried the same silent prayer she whispered every morning: "Let today be better." She arrived at the prestigious Carter & Co. headquarters, where marble floors gleamed under her careful hands, and towering glass walls reflected lives far grander than her own. Mary worked methodically, unnoticed by the suited employees who passed her by, some offering cold nods, others barely acknowledging her existence. Yet she bore it all with quiet grace, her gaze never faltering from the task at hand. In the break room, muffled conversations often reached her ears. "These maids," one junior staff whispered once, not realizing Mary stood nearby. "They're lucky to even be here. Can't imagine what they'd do without this job." Mary never responded, never let the sting show on her face. But deep within, she felt the weight of their dismissiveness pressing on her like an invisible burden. She focused on the mop in her hand, on the hours ahead, on the pay she would collect at the month's end to cover Janet's medicines and rent. She carried herself with an air of humility, avoiding unnecessary interaction, yet there was something about her quiet diligence that did not go unnoticed by everyone. Timothy Carter, the company's stoic CEO, occasionally glanced from the upper floors, his gaze lingering briefly before moving on, as if filing away a mental note. For Mary, each day was a repetition of labor, endurance, and suppressed hope until, unknowingly, her routine was about to intersect with something that would change the course of her life forever. Mary's return home each evening felt heavier than the one before. Their small apartment, with its peeling walls and single flickering bulb, bore silent witness to her mounting exhaustion. Inside, Janet sat propped on a thin mattress, a soft smile greeting her daughter despite the visible strain etched on her aging face. "You're home, my dear," Janet whispered, her voice a mere thread of sound. Mary forced a smile, kneeling beside her. "Yes, Mama. How are you feeling today?" she asked, though the answer was clear in the pallor of her mother's skin and the persistent wheeze in her breath. The doctors had warned about her condition worsening without proper treatment, but the money for hospital bills remained a distant dream. Janet gently reached for her daughter's hand, her touch feather-light. "Don't worry about me, Mary. You've done enough already," she said softly. Mary swallowed hard, nodding, but inside, the weight of responsibility pressed against her chest, suffocating. Bills piled in the corner, prescriptions left unfilled, and yet Mary refused to let her mother see her breaking. As she prepared a simple meal, the same thought gnawed at her. How much longer could she hold everything together before it all collapsed? Later that night, as the dim light struggled against the darkness, Mary sat quietly by the window, watching the distant city lights twinkle like unreachable stars. She thought about the coworkers she overheard at Carter & Co., who casually spoke of vacations, luxury dinners, and weekend retreats, lives she could never dream of. Janet's faint coughing snapped her back. Mary crossed the room quickly, sitting beside her mother, gently stroking her arm. "You need to rest, Mama. Tomorrow will be better," she whispered. Yet deep down, the gnawing fear remained. How could she promise that when tomorrow felt no different from today? As Janet drifted back to sleep, Mary stared into the darkness, her mind calculating how she could stretch her next paycheck, rent, food, medication, all while keeping up appearances at work. She knew she couldn't afford mistakes, not when every coin mattered. The world seemed indifferent, but Mary clung to the only thing she had left: determination. Unaware that life had a twist silently approaching, one that would test not only her resolve but her very integrity. At Carter & Co., Timothy Carter's name carried weight that could silence entire rooms. Employees walked on invisible eggshells around him, careful with every word and movement. His tailored suits, measured steps, and unreadable expressions left no room for familiarity. He was known not for outbursts, but for an unnerving calm that could slice sharper than anger. Sitting at the head of the long glass conference table, Timothy surveyed his senior staff with sharp eyes as they fumbled through presentations, each one desperate for approval. "Is this the best we can do?" he asked, voice smooth but devoid of warmth. No one dared meet his gaze. Outside the boardroom, whispers trailed behind him, rumors of how he clawed his way to the top, how he trusted no one, how no detail escaped his notice. But few knew the real Timothy, a man who carried memories of sleeping on dusty floors and watching doors close simply because he had nothing. He had built his empire brick by brick, mistake by mistake, and he now guarded it fiercely, trusting only a handful like Lewis, his childhood friend turned business partner. Later that day, as he stood by his office window overlooking the bustling city, Lewis entered unannounced, unbothered by Timothy's reserved nature. "You're wearing that look again," Lewis teased, sinking into a chair. Timothy gave a faint smile, almost imperceptible. "What look?" he asked. Lewis shrugged. "The one where you're calculating which of your loyal employees is loyal only to their paychecks." Timothy's eyes darkened slightly. "Loyalty is cheap these days, Lewis. Everyone's integrity has a price. I'm just wondering how many people here would pass a real test if put to it." Lewis chuckled but didn't argue. Timothy's gaze drifted back outside, his mind already weaving plans quietly. "One day I might put that theory to work," Timothy mused aloud, his tone unreadable. Lewis raised a brow but said nothing more. Timothy's world thrived on control, and control meant knowing who could be trusted. What he didn't yet realize was that the answer he sought might soon appear, not from the polished boardroom, but from the unlikeliest corner of his pristine building. Melissa strode through the sleek corridors of Carter & Co. with calculated poise, her heels clicking against the polished marble like a rhythmic reminder of her growing ambition. As Timothy's executive assistant, she stood closer to him than anyone else, privy to sensitive meetings and decisions. Yet in her mind, proximity wasn't enough. She wanted more recognition, authority, perhaps even a seat at the table. Her colleagues often envied her position, but Melissa saw herself as indispensable, always 2 steps ahead, always anticipating Timothy's needs. Still, something gnawed at her. No matter how flawlessly she performed, Timothy remained unreadable, offering neither praise nor reprimand, just his usual distant professionalism. One afternoon, as she organized files in his office, she glanced briefly at his empty seat and murmured under her breath, "I've earned more than this." It wasn't jealousy. It was a belief that loyalty alone should eventually yield reward. She had no patience for those beneath her who didn't understand the stakes, maids, clerks, junior staff. They existed in her periphery, invisible. Later that evening, Melissa found herself in the break room, sipping coffee as whispers floated past her. 2 junior staff members were gossiping about how Timothy barely noticed anyone. Melissa smiled faintly to herself, leaning closer. "That's because he's not interested in mediocrity," she interjected smoothly. The 2 women fell silent, eyes wide, embarrassed to be caught. Melissa's gaze sharpened as she added, "Only those who prove themselves truly indispensable catch his eye." She left them with that thought, returning to her desk with renewed determination. In her mind, the company was a game of chess, and she had spent years positioning herself perfectly. Yet, a flicker of doubt passed through her when she noticed Timothy's subtle observations of certain employees, particularly the maid who quietly swept outside his office. Melissa dismissed the thought quickly, focusing back on her goal. There was no way someone like Mary could pose a threat. After all, Melissa had invested too much time to let anyone disrupt the ladder she was still climbing. The sun cast a golden hue across Timothy's expansive office as Lewis casually leaned against the edge of the CEO's desk, flipping through a few documents Timothy had handed him. "You've built an empire, Tim, but the higher you climb, the harder it is to trust anyone," Lewis remarked thoughtfully, glancing up. Timothy sat back in his chair, gaze fixed on the city skyline beyond the window. "Exactly why I keep my circle tight," Timothy replied, his voice even but laced with something deeper. Lewis studied him closely. "What's bothering you this time?" he pressed. Timothy remained silent for a moment, tapping a pen rhythmically against the desk. Finally, he murmured, "I've been thinking. Loyalty is easy when everything's comfortable. But I want to know who still stands firm when faced with temptation." Lewis raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Are you planning something?" Timothy gave no clear answer, merely allowing the corners of his lips to lift faintly before diverting the conversation back to business as usual. Later that evening, after Lewis left, Timothy sat alone, his fingers tracing the edge of a thick, sealed envelope resting on his desk. His mind wandered to the various employees who passed through his corridors daily, each face familiar, yet unknown beneath the surface. He considered the polished executives who rehearsed their loyalty in board meetings, the assistants like Melissa who moved efficiently, but whose motives he could never quite read. And then, the quiet ones, the ones no one noticed. His gaze shifted momentarily as the door clicked open, and Mary silently stepped in to dust the corners of the room, eyes focused on her work, not him. Timothy observed her for a beat longer than usual, something flickering in his expression. He stood abruptly, straightening his suit. Without another word, he carefully slid the envelope into his drawer, locking it away. The seed of his plan was planted. But who, if anyone, would rise to meet his expectations remained to be seen. The air in the CEO's private lounge smelled faintly of cedarwood polish and crisp linen as Mary quietly pushed her cleaning cart inside, careful not to disturb the neat arrangement of leather chairs and glass tables. She worked efficiently, lost in her routine, until something unusual caught her eye, a thick, cream-colored envelope lying conspicuously on the edge of the glass coffee table. Her brows furrowed. It wasn't like anything she usually saw left behind. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, before cautiously picking it up. The weight surprised her. Curiosity pricked at her, but instinct told her not to pry. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she debated internally. With a breath, she set the envelope on her cart, intending to turn it over to the proper office, but not before she noticed a corner slightly torn, revealing bundles of crisp cash inside. Her heart lurched. Her throat felt dry as she finished cleaning the room, thoughts racing uncontrollably. By the time she stepped out into the hallway, her palms were damp. Part of her screamed to march straight to human resources and hand it over. Another part, quieter but persistent, whispered cruel reminders of overdue rent, unpaid hospital bills, and her mother's frail condition. One envelope, she thought bitterly, could fix everything in one sweep. But Mary pushed the thought down, gripping the handle of her cart tighter as if it anchored her morality. She glanced around, aware of employees passing without noticing her distress. Melissa strode past without a second glance, too engrossed in her own world. Mary swallowed hard and wheeled the cart toward the HR department, determination battling the temptation clawing at her. Whatever the envelope contained, it wasn't hers. Her conscience wouldn't allow her to act otherwise, even if it meant continuing to struggle for every coin. Mary sat quietly in her small kitchen later that evening, her elbows resting on the worn wooden table as Janet gently peeled an orange across from her. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the occasional cough from her mother. Mary's mind remained restless, replaying the moment her fingers brushed against the stack of money inside the envelope earlier that day. The memory lingered like a shadow. Janet glanced at her daughter, noticing the distant look clouding her eyes. "You're unusually quiet tonight, Mary. Something bothering you?" she asked softly. Mary forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's nothing, Mama. Just thinking." Janet reached across the table, squeezing her hand gently. "Whatever it is, don't let it weigh you down alone," she murmured. But how could Mary confess the war raging in her mind? How could she admit that, for one fleeting moment, she'd imagined how much easier life could be if she hadn't been honest? Sleep evaded Mary that night. She lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, as thoughts gnawed at her like persistent insects. The hospital bills were due again, and the pharmacist had warned her that without full payment, they wouldn't extend Janet's prescriptions. She pressed her palms against her forehead, breathing shakily. "What harm would it have done?" she whispered into the darkness. But no answer came, only the oppressive weight of her conscience. She remembered the way her mother always emphasized integrity when she was younger, teaching her that dignity wasn't something money could buy. Tears pricked her eyes. By morning, her decision was clear, even if it meant enduring sleepless nights and the constant ache of worry. She dressed quietly, steeling herself to return to the office, unaware that her simple act of honesty was about to set unforeseen events into motion, ones that would reach far beyond the envelope she returned. Mary stood hesitantly outside the Human Resources office, the envelope heavy in her hand, as though its weight had doubled overnight. Her heart pounded as she replayed her decision, questioning herself one last time. Could she really afford to walk away from an opportunity that could clear every debt she and her mother faced? Her fingers tightened around the envelope as a voice from within the office called out, "Next, please." Mary inhaled deeply, stepped inside, and approached the desk. "Good morning," she began softly, clearing her throat. "I found this while cleaning in the executive lounge yesterday. I believe it may belong to someone important." The HR officer raised an eyebrow at the sealed envelope, curiosity flickering briefly before accepting it. "Thank you, Mary. We'll handle it from here." No fuss, no questions, just a polite dismissal. She nodded, turning to leave without expectation of praise or recognition, unaware that her choice had been quietly noted from a distance. As she walked back to her cleaning station, Mary's chest felt lighter, though the struggles outside work loomed just as heavy. She had made her choice, not for reward, but because she couldn't bear the thought of compromising the values her mother instilled in her. But it didn't stop the gnawing ache when she thought of Janet's frailty, of the unpaid rent notice tacked to their door. She moved through the corridors mechanically, blending into the background like she always did. She passed Melissa, who glanced briefly in her direction but quickly dismissed her presence, unaware of the moral storm Mary had weathered that morning. Mary paused briefly by the window, the city buzzing outside, and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Her sacrifice wouldn't change her circumstances today, but at least, she thought, she could still look her mother in the eye when she returned home. What she didn't know was that someone else, someone far removed from the HR desk, had taken keen interest in the envelope's return and the woman behind it. The office was abuzz that afternoon with the usual murmur of conversations, most harmless, some more pointed. In the break room, Melissa stood by the coffee machine when two junior staff members approached, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers. "Did you hear?" one began, casting a quick glance around. "Someone found an envelope full of cash yesterday. Turned it in, apparently." The other snickered softly. "Yeah, right. Like anyone would hand it over without pocketing something first." Melissa arched a brow, stirring her coffee slowly. Though she hadn't paid much attention to the maid, the mention piqued her interest. She remained silent, allowing the gossip to swirl, but her mind began piecing things together. Later, she overheard that it was Mary, the quiet, unassuming maid, who had returned the money. Melissa couldn't hide her skepticism. People were rarely so selfless without an angle, and she found herself eyeing Mary with a new kind of suspicion. That suspicion didn't take long to trickle down. By the following day, more whispers followed Mary through the corridors like shadows. Some staff nodded respectfully in passing, others cast doubtful glances behind her back. "Maybe she kept a portion and returned the rest," one voice murmured. "No one's that honest." Mary heard them, though she kept her gaze low, her expression unreadable. Inside, she wrestled with a mixture of frustration and hurt. She hadn't returned the envelope for applause, but neither had she expected to be judged. In the cafeteria, she sat alone, quietly eating her lunch while snippets of conversation floated past. Melissa, seated a few tables away, exchanged a knowing glance with a fellow assistant, her lips curling faintly. "People will do anything to impress the right person," Melissa commented, voice smooth. Mary kept her head down, but the words stung. Still, she resolved not to let their doubts sway her. She hadn't chosen honesty for anyone else. She had chosen it for herself and her mother. Timothy sat in his office, fingers steepled beneath his chin as Lewis stood by the window, relaying the latest updates. "The envelope you left. It was turned in yesterday." By the maid, Mary, Lewis informed casually. Timothy's brow lifted slightly, though his expression remained composed. Mary, he repeated, as if tasting the name on his tongue. Lewis nodded, adding, didn't hesitate. HR confirmed she brought it straight to them, untouched. Timothy leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. He hadn't anticipated the test, reaching the hands of someone so far removed from the polished ranks of executives. He tapped a pen rhythmically against his desk, mind working. Interesting, he murmured, almost to himself. Lewis watched him closely. You planning to acknowledge it? He asked. Timothy offered only a faint smile. No need just yet. I'd rather see how she carries herself when no one's applauding. That evening, as Mary passed by Timothy's office unknowingly, he stood by the glass wall, gaze following her retreating figure. He noticed how she moved efficiently, avoiding eye contact, never drawing attention. Most employees would have subtly hinted at their good deed, fishing for approval, but not her. Melissa stepped into his office shortly after, delivering files. Anything else you need before I leave, sir? She asked, her tone crisp. Timothy glanced at her briefly. No, that'll be all, he replied. But as the door closed behind her, his gaze drifted once more toward the hallway Mary had disappeared down. For the first time in a long while, Timothy felt a sliver of curiosity, not toward the board members or ambitious assistants, but toward the maid who had quietly passed a test none of them even knew existed. And he had every intention of watching her a little more closely. Timothy sat at his desk the following morning, his eyes lingering on the freshly printed schedules laid before him. His gaze settled on one particular name, Mary. Without lifting his head, he picked up the intercom phone and pressed the button. Melissa, could you come in for a moment? A few minutes later, Melissa entered, a clipboard in hand, always poised, always polished. Yes, sir, she asked, standing expectantly. Timothy didn't look up as he spoke. Have the cleaning schedules revised. I want Mary assigned to my office from now on. Exclusively. Melissa's brow twitched slightly, but she masked it quickly. Mary, the maid, she clarified, voice measured. Timothy nodded curtly, still scanning his documents. Yes, notify the housekeeping supervisor. Melissa's lips pressed together in a thin line. Understood, sir. As she exited, her mind churned, filing away this sudden change, though she made no comment. Later, Mary stood by the housekeeping station when the supervisor approached her, clipboard in hand. Mary, new assignment. Starting tomorrow, you'll be handling the CEO's office exclusively. Orders from upstairs. Mary blinked, momentarily startled. The CEO's office? She echoed, unsure she'd heard correctly. The supervisor nodded briskly before moving on, leaving Mary with questions she couldn't voice. She'd never been directly assigned to such a prominent area before. That night at home, she shared the news with her mother while preparing dinner. Janet smiled weakly. Maybe they've finally noticed how hardworking you are, she said softly. But Mary wasn't so sure. She felt a quiet unease settle over her, unsure why someone like Timothy Carter would pay attention to someone like her. Still, she resolved to carry out her duties with the same quiet diligence, unaware that Timothy's eyes would soon be observing more closely than ever before. Melissa stood at her desk, her perfectly polished nails tapping rhythmically against her tablet as she reviewed the latest schedule updates. She couldn't shake the nagging irritation that had settled deep inside her since Timothy's unexpected directive, reassigning a maid to clean his office exclusively. It seemed unnecessary, more than that, suspicious. As she watched Mary quietly move through the corridor later that afternoon, head bowed, Melissa's thoughts simmered. After all these years of loyalty, was Timothy seriously paying attention to someone like her? Crossing her arms, Melissa intercepted Mary as she neared the elevators. Mary, she called, voice calm but edged. Mary stopped, lifting her gaze hesitantly. Yes, ma'am? Melissa offered a tight smile. Just a word of advice. Working near the CEO comes with expectations. Don't let this reassignment go to your head. Keep your place, and things will stay smooth. Mary's throat tightened slightly, but she nodded politely. I understand, ma'am, she replied quietly before continuing on. Melissa watched her retreating figure with narrowed eyes, unsatisfied. It wasn't that she feared a maid could outmaneuver her, but she hated unpredictability, hated not knowing why Timothy was suddenly watching. Returning to her office, she glanced toward Timothy's door, mind working overtime. Was this a temporary decision, or did it signal something deeper? She resolved to keep her own eyes open, certain that whatever game was unfolding, she wasn't about to be left behind. Meanwhile, Mary, though rattled by the brief encounter, kept her head down, focusing solely on the work ahead. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension had been set in motion, one neither of them fully understood yet. The hum of the evening traffic barely reached the cramped apartment where Mary sat beside her mother, gently helping Janet sip water from a cup. The frailty in her mother's hands was impossible to ignore now. Janet's cough had worsened, her breaths shallow and labored. "You didn't have to rush home, my dear," Janet whispered weakly, her voice rasping. Mary offered a soft, strained smile as she wiped her mother's forehead. "I wanted to, Mama. You need to rest." But beneath her calm exterior, Mary's heart twisted painfully. Earlier that day, she'd received another call from the hospital, reminding her that Janet's next appointment required full payment up front. The number they quoted made her stomach drop. Her current earnings barely covered their rent and groceries. How could she afford medical bills spiraling out of control? Late into the night, Mary sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers nervously folding and unfolding her apron. Her mind replayed the HR department's indifferent expression as she returned the envelope days ago. She didn't regret her decision, but the gnawing reality of her circumstances felt inescapable. She thought of her mother's pale face, the stack of unpaid bills on the corner table, and felt a tight knot form in her chest. There was no savior on the horizon, no easy solution. She had no choice but to keep working, to carry on even as life weighed heavier with every passing day. Tomorrow, she would step back into Carter & Co., face the quiet whispers, clean the pristine offices, including Timothy's now, and pretend that everything was fine. Because quitting wasn't an option. Not when her mother's life quite literally depended on her endurance. Lewis arrived at Timothy's office unannounced that afternoon, as he often did, walking in without knocking. He settled comfortably into the leather chair across from Timothy's desk, watching his friend silently shuffle through reports. "You've been unusually preoccupied these days," Lewis remarked casually, his sharp eyes not missing the slight pause in Timothy's movements. "Care to share why a maid is now your personal observation project?" Timothy glanced up, one brow raised, lips twitching faintly. "Is it that obvious?" he muttered, leaning back in his chair. Lewis chuckled. "You forget. I've known you long enough to spot when you're testing people." Timothy sighed, fingers tapping the armrest thoughtfully. "I've been wondering who around me is truly trustworthy. I thought loyalty would be clearer by now. But sometimes it shows up in the most unexpected places." Lewis nodded, his expression turning serious. "Careful, Tim. You're looking at the chessboard too hard, waiting for someone to outmaneuver you. Not everyone has a hidden agenda." Timothy didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting out the window. "I came from nothing, Lewis. I've seen how money changes people. I need to know who won't fold when temptation shows up." Lewis leaned forward slightly, voice softer. "Maybe what you're looking for isn't in polished boardrooms or ambitious assistants. Maybe it's in people who have nothing to gain, yet still do the right thing." Timothy's eyes flickered at that, thoughtful. Lewis rose, patting his shoulder lightly. "Don't judge too quickly. Sometimes integrity speaks loudest when no one's listening." Timothy watched his friend leave, the words lingering long after. Quietly, he glanced toward the door, where he knew Mary was likely tending her duties. Without realizing it, the layers of observation were becoming something more, a search not for perfection, but for authenticity. The air inside Carter & Co. buzzed with the usual activity as Mary moved through her cleaning routine, careful and efficient as always. Yet amidst her own personal struggles, she remained quietly observant of others. One afternoon, she noticed a young junior staff member, Elsie, standing nervously outside one of the executive offices, papers clutched tightly in hand, eyes darting anxiously. Something in Elsie's posture reminded Mary of herself, that familiar tension of trying to keep up appearances while quietly drowning. Without hesitation, Mary approached her, wiping her hands on her apron. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. Elsie jumped slightly before offering a weak smile. I misplaced an important file," she admitted, voice trembling. "If anyone finds out, I could lose my job." Mary's heart clenched. She knew how fragile positions like theirs were, how one mistake could tip everything. Without second thought, Mary offered, "Come on, let's retrace your steps. Maybe we can find it before anyone notices." For the next half hour, the two moved discreetly through various offices and corners, quietly searching. Finally, Mary spotted the missing file tucked beneath a cabinet and retrieved it, handing it over with a reassuring smile. Elsie's eyes filled with relief. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done," she whispered, clearly overwhelmed. Mary only shook her head. "It's all right. Just be more careful next time." She watched as Elsie hurried off, clutching the file tightly, her posture a little straighter now. As Mary returned to her cart, she had no idea that Timothy, walking past unseen, had witnessed the entire exchange from a distance. He lingered momentarily, eyes narrowed in thought. In a world where ambition often overshadowed kindness, Mary's simple, selfless act echoed louder than she realized. Timothy sat at his desk the next morning, the hum of office activity filtering faintly through his door. For weeks, he had been quietly observing Mary from afar, analyzing not just her work ethic, but the subtle ways she carried herself. Today, however, he decided to shift his approach. Pressing the intercom, he spoke succinctly. "Melissa, could you send Mary in when she's available?" Minutes later, there was a soft knock before Mary entered, her eyes cautious, posture respectful. "Good morning, sir," she greeted quietly. Timothy nodded, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. "Sit," he offered simply, watching as she complied, clearly unsure why she was summoned. For a moment, he studied her, noting how she avoided eye contact, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Tell me, Mary, how long have you worked here?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Mary hesitated slightly before replying. "3 years, sir," Timothy nodded, leaning forward. "And in all that time, has anyone ever taken the time to ask how you're doing?" The question caught her off guard, her eyes lifting briefly before dropping again. "No, sir, but that's all right. I'm here to work." He observed her closely, the hint of sincerity in her tone unmistakable. "Still, it's not often I see someone handle their duties so quietly yet consistently," Timothy added, voice calm. "You returned something valuable recently. You didn't have to." Mary's fingers tightened slightly, but she kept her gaze steady. "It wasn't mine to keep, sir," she replied simply. Timothy leaned back, intrigued by her straightforwardness. "That kind of honesty isn't common," he remarked, his voice unreadable. As she stood to leave, he added casually, "You'll continue cleaning my office. I like things in order." Mary nodded politely, stepping out, but her heart raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the surface was shifting, though she couldn't quite name it yet. Melissa sat at her desk, eyes flicking repeatedly toward Timothy's office door, a knot twisting tighter in her stomach with each passing day. She couldn't ignore it anymore, the growing frequency with which Mary appeared around the CEO's office. It wasn't just cleaning schedules anymore. Timothy himself had started calling her indirectly, something he had never done with anyone outside the executive circle. Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched Mary exit quietly after one such meeting, her expression unreadable. The whispers had begun circling among staff, subtle but persistent. "Why's the maid always around the boss lately?" Melissa caught the comments, her irritation simmering beneath her polished exterior. She prided herself on loyalty, precision, and ambition, qualities she believed deserved recognition. Yet, here was a maid who seemed to attract Timothy's attention effortlessly, and it gnawed at her pride. Later that afternoon, Melissa deliberately intercepted Mary in the hallway, her voice measured but cool. "Mary," she began smoothly, stepping into her path. Mary stopped, lifting her gaze cautiously. "Yes, ma'am." Melissa folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. "I've noticed you've been spending quite some time near Mr. Carter's office. I hope you understand the expectations here. Familiarity can be misunderstood." The words were polite, but the undertone sharp. Mary swallowed, choosing her response carefully. I'm just doing what I was assigned, ma'am. Melissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. Good. Keep it professional. The last thing you want is to seem out of place. Without waiting for a reply, she walked away, heels clicking sharply. Mary remained still for a moment, the weight of the subtle warning lingering. She hadn't asked for special attention, yet the shift was undeniable, and so too was the discomfort that seemed to follow it. The following week, Carter and Co.'s boardroom held an entirely different kind of tension. Timothy sat at the head of the long, gleaming table, eyes narrowed as he listened to the senior executives presenting the quarterly reports. On the surface, everything appeared polished, the numbers respectable. But Timothy's keen instincts picked up on something beneath the glossy facade, a lack of cohesion, of genuine loyalty. As one executive droned on about cost-cutting strategies, Timothy's gaze shifted subtly from face to face, noting the veiled ambition in some, the thinly veiled resentment in others. When the presentation concluded, he leaned back, voice calm but cool. It's easy to recite numbers. Harder to display character when it counts, he remarked pointedly, letting the statement hang in the air like a challenge. After the meeting, Lewis found him in his office, a wry smile playing at his lips. You're stirring the pot again, I see, Lewis commented, dropping into a chair. Timothy glanced at him, exhaling softly. They're too comfortable. Comfortable people stop paying attention to what matters. Lewis chuckled, but said nothing more. As Timothy's gaze drifted to the hallway where Mary often passed, his mind contrasted the boardroom's polished facades with the quiet integrity he'd observed in her. It was a stark reminder of how often the people society overlooked displayed the values others only pretended to have. That realization settled heavily on him as he tapped a pen against his desk, knowing soon he'd need to make decisions about who truly belonged in his trusted circle and who didn't. The phone call came late in the afternoon, catching Mary just as she finished wiping down the last desk in one of the executive offices. The voice on the other end was strained, apologetic, but firm. Miss Mary, I'm sorry to inform you. Your mother's condition has worsened. She collapsed earlier. She needs to be admitted immediately. Mary's breath hitched as the words registered, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. Please, hold her for me. I'll be there as soon as I can, she whispered before hanging up, panic clawing at her chest. She quickly gathered her things, her mind racing. The cost of Janet's care had always lingered like a dark cloud over her, but now the urgency felt like a noose tightening. As Mary reached home, she found Janet barely conscious, a neighbor helping to steady her frail frame. Without hesitation, she gathered her mother's things, leading her to the small clinic nearby. The doctor's face was grim. Her breathing's weak, her heart unstable. We can't continue without proper treatment. Full payment is required up front, he stated bluntly. Mary nodded numbly, knowing she had no such money on hand. She spent the night at the hospital, sitting at her mother's bedside, holding her hand tightly. The stress and exhaustion blurred together, but one thought dominated her mind. No matter how hard she worked, it never seemed enough. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to regret returning the envelope weeks ago. But with the looming medical bills, she wondered quietly how much longer she could carry the weight of both honesty and survival on her shoulders. Timothy sat alone in his dimly lit office late into the evening, the city lights casting fragmented reflections across the glass walls. The day's boardroom meetings still lingered in his mind, numbers, faces, but none of them carrying the weight of trust he sought. Yet, amidst the noise of polished suits and rehearsed smiles, it was Mary's quiet presence that kept surfacing in his thoughts. He recalled how effortlessly she blended into the background, yet how consistently she stood firm in character without seeking validation. His fingers tapped against the edge of a folder as he considered his next move. He didn't believe in making impulsive decisions, especially not about who he let close. But there was something about Mary's honesty, unprompted and uncelebrated, that he couldn't ignore any longer. Lewis entered without knocking, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You're still here," he observed. Timothy looked up briefly, nodding. "Thinking," he replied. Lewis studied him closely before speaking again. "You're about to shake things up, aren't you?" Timothy gave the faintest smile. Possibly. But this time I want it quiet. No announcements, no eyes watching. Lewis raised a brow but didn't question further. After he left, Timothy picked up his phone, calling Melissa. Tomorrow morning, inform HR that Mary's contract will be reviewed. I want her records sent to me. Melissa hesitated on the other end. Understood, sir, she replied, though confusion flickered in her voice. Timothy hung up, leaning back. He was done waiting for loyalty to prove itself among those who wore masks. It was time to take a chance, but on someone least expected. The next day unfolded like any other, until Mary was unexpectedly summoned to the CEO's office. Her heart raced as she wiped her hands on her apron, unsure what she had done to warrant his attention again. Stepping inside, she found Timothy seated, expression unreadable. He gestured toward the seat opposite. Sit, Mary. She obeyed, clasping her hands nervously in her lap. Timothy's eyes met hers steadily. I've been watching you, he began without preamble, noticing how you handle yourself. Quietly, without drawing attention, yet consistently. Mary's brows knitted slightly, unsure where this was leading. He continued, voice calm but firm. I don't believe in rewarding loud ambition, but I value honesty and loyalty. He leaned forward, hands clasped. I want to offer you a new role, my personal assistant. Mary's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, convinced she'd misheard. Sir, me, she stammered. Timothy nodded. Yes, you. I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands responsibility without needing to shout about it. Her mind spun, unsure how to process the offer. She looked down, overwhelmed. I don't think I'm qualified for such a position, she murmured. Timothy's voice softened slightly. I wouldn't offer it if I didn't believe you were capable. Silence stretched for a moment. You don't have to decide now. Take time. Think about it. Mary stood shakily, nodding once before leaving the office. As she walked back down the hallway, her heart pounded. Everything felt surreal, as if the ground beneath her had shifted unexpectedly. She had no idea her life had just pivoted at that very moment. Mary sat quietly at the small kitchen table that evening, her hands folded tightly together as Janet looked on, sensing something was weighing heavily on her daughter. Mary, you've barely touched your food, Janet spoke gently, her voice still faint from illness. Mary glanced up, forcing a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mama, something happened today at work. Mr. Carter, he offered me a new position, she murmured. Janet's brows furrowed with concern. A new position? What kind of position? Mary hesitated before answering. He wants me to become his personal assistant. The words felt foreign even leaving her mouth. Janet's eyes widened slightly, though her smile soon followed. That's good news, isn't it? You've worked so hard for so long. Maybe he's finally recognizing it. Mary shook her head, her throat tight. I don't know, Mama. It feels too big. I don't belong in that world. I'm just me. She trailed off, the self-doubt she'd carried for years rising quickly. Janet reached out, her frail fingers brushing her daughter's knuckles. Mary, do you know why you've come this far, even when the odds were against you? Because you never compromised who you are. Maybe that's exactly what he sees. Mary swallowed hard, blinking back unexpected tears. But what if I fail? She whispered. Janet squeezed her hand weakly. You won't fail, not with the heart you have. That night, as Mary lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she turned the offer over in her mind again and again. Fear and uncertainty warred within her, but beneath it all, something else stirred. A flicker of hope she couldn't quite ignore. Melissa stood stiffly outside Timothy's office, her polished composure faltering beneath the weight of rumors she could no longer ignore. She had heard the whispers, the maid being offered a new position, one that once seemed reserved for someone like her. Frustration churned beneath her skin as she knocked once, entering after Timothy's voice called out. Melissa, he greeted, barely glancing up as he signed a document. She swallowed, summoning her most professional tone. Sir, if I may, there's something I need to clarify. Timothy's pen paused mid-stroke, eyes lifting to meet hers. Go on, he prompted, his gaze sharp. Melissa drew in a slow breath. I've worked here for years. I've been loyal, efficient. I've handled responsibilities most wouldn't touch. And now, there's talk. Her voice wavered despite herself. Talk that you're considering someone entirely unqualified for a position I've been preparing myself for." Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Timothy regarded her quietly before speaking. "Melissa, you've done your job well. But what I require isn't just efficiency." His tone remained calm, unwavering. "I've spent too long surrounded by people who play roles. I need someone whose loyalty isn't tied to ambition." Melissa's heart pounded painfully as she absorbed his words. "So, everything I've done wasn't enough?" she asked tightly. Timothy's expression softened marginally. "It wasn't about being enough. It's about trust when no one's watching." His words were final, and Melissa felt the sting of them long after she left his office. The following morning, Timothy summoned Mary to his office once again. She entered cautiously, still unsure of her footing in this unfamiliar dynamic. Timothy gestured for her to sit, leaning back in his chair, his eyes unreadable. "Mary, I imagine by now you've wondered why I offered you the assistant position," he began. She nodded slowly, unsure whether to speak. He continued, voice even but direct. "A few weeks ago, I left an envelope, one filled with a significant sum, in the executive lounge. It wasn't misplaced. It was deliberate." Mary's eyes widened slightly as realization dawned. Timothy's gaze didn't waver. It was a test, to see who, if anyone, would return it without question. Her heart pounded, recalling the internal battle she'd fought over that very envelope. Timothy's voice softened. "Most people wouldn't have, but you did, without fanfare, without expecting reward." Mary swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap. "I only did what I believed was right," she murmured. He nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why I trust you now." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken weight. Timothy stood, walking around the desk. "Mary, positions like assistant or executive mean nothing if the person in them lacks integrity. I don't want titles without substance. You've proven yourself when no one was looking." Mary looked up, her chest tight, unable to find words. For the first time, she understood fully why everything had unfolded the way it had, and it left her both humbled and overwhelmed. Mary stood at the large window of her apartment that evening, the city lights blinking faintly in the distance as her mind raced. Janet sat nearby, watching her daughter with quiet concern. "What's weighing on you now, my dear?" she asked gently. Mary turned, exhaling shakily. "Mama, Mr. Carter told me everything today. About how he tested everyone. About why he offered me the position." Janet's brows lifted, listening intently. "And," Mary hesitated, her voice trembling, "I never imagined I would be chosen for something so important. I don't know if I'm ready." Janet reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Mary, life rarely waits until we feel ready. Sometimes it's about taking the chance anyway." The words lingered long after Janet drifted off to sleep. Mary sat alone, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the long days cleaning floors, the whispered doubts from others, the weight of responsibility at home. And despite all the uncertainty swirling inside her, there was something else, too. A quiet sense of worth, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. The next morning, she entered Timothy's office, standing a little taller. "Sir," she said softly, meeting his gaze, "I've thought about your offer. If you still believe I'm the right person, I accept." Timothy's expression didn't shift much, but she saw it, a flicker of satisfaction beneath his calm exterior. "Good," he replied simply. "Let's get started." And just like that, the course of her life took its first irreversible turn. Mary stood stiffly outside her new office, her palms damp despite her best efforts to appear composed. Gone were the days of carrying a mop and quietly passing through unnoticed. Now she was in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by sleek desks and sharply dressed professionals who watched her with thinly veiled curiosity. She took a breath before stepping inside, eyes scanning the neatly arranged workspace. It felt surreal, sitting behind a polished desk instead of scrubbing floors. The computer before her, the phone lines, the appointment schedules, all of it seemed foreign. Timothy's voice broke her thoughts as he appeared briefly by the door. "If you need help settling in, ask Melissa. She'll show you the ropes," he instructed calmly before disappearing back into his office. Mary swallowed hard, unsure if that offer of help was genuine or another quiet test. The real challenge came not from the tasks themselves, but from navigating the stares and whispers that followed her. Every time she crossed the corridor or answered a call, she felt eyes on her. Some, like Melissa's, were cool and calculating. Others flickered with confusion or disdain. Mary fumbled with a spreadsheet, biting her lip when an error message blinked on the screen. Melissa approached without invitation, her smile tight. "Need assistance?" she asked smoothly, leaning over to correct the mistake with practiced ease. Mary offered a quiet thank you, but the tension lingered like a shadow. At home, she barely spoke, weighed down by the pressure of proving she belonged. Each night, she replayed the day's mistakes, wondering if she could truly rise to meet the expectations that had suddenly been placed upon her. The title came easily. Confidence, however, did not. Melissa sat at her desk, her gaze flicking periodically toward Mary, who was hunched over a pile of documents, visibly struggling. For days, Melissa had watched her, part of her wanting to feel vindicated, wanting to see Mary stumble. Yet, beneath her carefully maintained exterior, a different feeling gnawed at her. She recalled Timothy's words during their last conversation, how he valued loyalty, but not the kind that wore ambition like armor. That night, unable to shake the discomfort, Melissa found herself reflecting on her own journey. She had climbed steadily, yes, but somewhere along the way, she had let competition cloud everything else. Watching Mary struggle brought a realization she hadn't anticipated. She saw a version of herself in those early days, minus the defenses. The next morning, as Mary quietly rifled through the filing cabinet, Melissa approached without her usual stiffness. "Mary," she called, softer this time. Mary straightened, wary. "Yes, ma'am." Melissa hesitated briefly, then offered a genuine nod. "You don't have to figure everything out alone. No one starts off knowing it all." Mary blinked, taken aback by the shift in tone. I appreciate that," she said carefully. For the first time, there was no condescension in Melissa's gaze, just something resembling understanding. Throughout the day, Melissa subtly guided Mary through tasks, her critiques now laced with patience. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it marked a turning point, one that surprised even Melissa. In helping Mary adjust, she inadvertently confronted her own flaws, realizing that real strength wasn't about keeping others beneath her, but knowing when to extend a hand. Mary's steps felt lighter as she made her way home that evening, her head still swimming from the surprising shift with Melissa. Yet, her heart remained tethered to something more pressing, Janet's health. For weeks, hospital bills and medication costs had loomed like an ever-present threat. But her new position, though demanding, brought with it a salary that gave her room to breathe, room to hope. Entering the apartment, she found her mother seated at the small table, looking stronger, her cheeks less hollow than they'd been weeks ago. "You're home, my dear," Janet greeted warmly, her voice steadier than it had been in months. Mary crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside her. "Mama, I've arranged the next hospital visit," she said softly. "This time, everything is covered." Tears welled in Janet's eyes as she reached to cup her daughter's face. "You've done so much for me, Mary. Too much." Mary shook her head firmly, blinking back her own tears. "You've done more for me, Mama. This is the least I can do." That weekend, she accompanied Janet to the hospital, where, for the first time in a long while, the doctor's tone was hopeful. Treatment would continue without interruption. Sitting beside her mother afterward, Mary felt an unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest, not relief exactly, but something steadier. For years, she'd borne everything alone, but now, the small victories, no matter how quietly won, were beginning to rewrite the story she had always told herself about survival. For the first time, she allowed herself to think of a future that wasn't defined by hardship alone. The soft glow of the office lights reflected faintly on the large window as Timothy stood quietly, hands tucked into his pockets. It was late, long after most employees had left, but Mary remained, sorting files meticulously at her desk. He watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice breaking the stillness. "Mary, finish up and come into my office. There's something I want to share." Startled, she glanced up but quickly nodded, gathering her things. Once inside, she took a tentative seat while Timothy poured 2 cups of coffee, placing one before her without ceremony. "You've done well these past weeks," he began, leaning back in his chair. but I doubt you know much about me beyond the title of CEO. Mary shook her head, unsure where the conversation was headed. Timothy exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. I wasn't born into this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the elegant office surrounding them. I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment. Single mother, no help, no safety nets. Mary's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. He continued, voice even but carrying weight. I started from the ground, sweeping floors much like you did. I've built walls since then, walls to protect everything I worked for. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how much strength lives in humility. His eyes locked onto hers. That's why I noticed you, Mary. Not because of a title or resume. Because you remind me of where I came from. She swallowed, her throat tight, touched by the quiet vulnerability in his tone. In that moment, she realized that beneath his controlled exterior lay a man who understood struggle far more intimately than anyone assumed. It shifted something unspoken between them, a shared understanding, untainted by status. The air inside Carter & Co. felt different the next morning as Mary walked purposefully through the corridors, no longer avoiding eye contact, no longer shrinking from whispered glances. Clad in a simple but neat suit, she carried herself with a quiet confidence earned not by privilege, but by resilience. As she approached the boardroom, she paused briefly, taking in the scene, executives seated, documents spread out, conversations humming low. Timothy stood at the head of the table, his expression neutral, but his eyes meeting hers with something almost resembling approval. "Mary," he called evenly, motioning for her to step forward. Without hesitation, she crossed the threshold, setting down the reports she had prepared. As she settled beside Timothy, she couldn't help but reflect on the long road that had brought her here. Every challenge, every sacrifice, every moment she doubted herself had quietly shaped the woman standing confidently now. Glancing toward Melissa, she caught the faintest nod, a gesture of mutual respect hard-earned over time. Timothy's voice broke the silence as he began the meeting, seamlessly transitioning into updates, but Mary's mind drifted momentarily. She thought of her mother at home, finally resting peacefully. She thought of the younger version of herself, once overlooked, now valued. No grand declarations marked this day, no loud applause. Just a steady, undeniable truth. She had found her place, not by changing who she was, but by holding steadfast to it. And in doing so, she had become a pillar in a world that once felt unreachable. Here's the Bible verse, Luke 16, verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. This verse reflects Mary's journey beautifully, how her integrity in small, unseen acts ultimately earned her trust, respect, and a greater position. Her honesty, when no one was watching, became the foundation for the doors that opened for her. Moral of the story: true integrity shines brightest when no one is watching. The greatest rewards in life often come not from ambition or recognition, but from unwavering honesty, kindness, and staying true to one's values, even when faced with hardship or temptation. Mary's story teaches us that the strength of character is measured in the quiet moments, when decisions are made without expectation of applause, and that those who remain faithful in small things are often entrusted with far greater opportunities. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.